Good evening. How are you? This is my stand-in talk, in part because we had some snow here today. Not a lot, a dusting, but the temperatures and the wind made us pay a little attention to our pigs that are outside, and we we can get them into these small little houses that we have for them, and they do quite well there. They snuggle up against each other, but we just give them a little TLC on a day like this. So as a result, it was too dark by the time we had done all this. There are a bunch of issues going on in no particular order. One of the first things that disturbs me, of course, is the speaker giving the January 6th material exclusively to Fox News and giving it to a group whose association with the truth is remote, occasional, and rarely observed. And so my answer to all of that is give it to everyone. This is the public's right to know. This was in the people's house in Congress where these hearings were held. It was in the people's house where the attacks occurred, as well as the entire Capitol, of course. And so we should make it available to everybody. Let sunlight be the cure. Let it secure the right of access to information that the government has. And these talks about security and so forth, I just think it's a make weight to avoid making it public and known to us. And if there are really serious reservations about any of the material in terms of security or perhaps deals that were made, okay, well, that's something else to consider. But otherwise, I think it should all be out there for everyone to know. Now, shifting gears to another area of the criminal law, let's talk about Mr. Murdaugh and whether or not he killed his wife and son. Well, I don't know about that because I only listened to a portion of the cross-examination, and I found it wanting. I found it wanting because Murdaugh wasn't controlled, and I've said this already. And I found it wanting because he allowed, by his direct questions, as opposed to a leading question, he allowed Murdaugh to basically control the examination and to get information into the record that ordinarily wouldn't be permitted and would have been subject to objection, you would think, by the defense, and the prosecution wouldn't want some of that stuff in there. And I've said this before. You've heard me talk about magic moments in politics and law and even personal relations, something that sums up everything that's going on. And if I were a prosecutor in the case, if I had seen it, I would have a better read on it. And I didn't see TV, I only heard the sound. This notion of the jurors giving Kleenex to Murdaugh when he was crying and upset, seemingly, about the loss of his wife and his son. That's very dangerous stuff. You can talk about the reason, you can talk about how he lies about everything, you can do all of that. But if one juror who perhaps gave those Kleenex to him holds on to that, you could have a hung jury. And the hung jury, if it happens because of that cross, it happens because of that prosecutor. And there are a bunch of professionals out there, that is to say, people like me who do trial work, saying, "Oh, well, it really doesn't matter much." But I'd like to say that the other ones out there, like me, who are saying this was disastrous, and the question is, will it matter in the end, remains to be seen, and we will know in a few days. Another issue that bothers me is, of course, the derailed train. And the EPA is now saying that there were 9 air pollutants at levels that could raise health concerns. Now, you may remember at the beginning of this, the railroad said, don't worry, go back. There's nothing in the air. Don't worry about the water. If you're getting town water, you're okay. And the other water, maybe you should be careful. People playing fast and loose with the facts, that's a real concern. And we're definitely in a period of post-truth, the post-truth period, in which truth doesn't matter. And I'd also say it was a post-law period, which means we're in an area, not Wild West yet, but where chaos can reign because the facts don't matter and the law doesn't matter, and people slip the punch, if you will, to avoid dealing with what is true and what is lawful. I don't know if you saw the recent movie, recent, several years I think it is, Chicago 7. And when I watched it again, it struck me that we get accustomed to the notion of thinking and trusting institutions that don't deserve our trust. Now, in the case of Chicago 7, it is very controversial, and I was at law school at the time. And one of the lawyers who handled the case, Weinglass, came to Columbia Law School, and he was giving a lecture. And I was sitting in the back because they came in late. There was a sprinkling of people down to the front row, and it's a very large courtroom because it was the first year courtroom. I say courtroom, hall, if you will, study hall or presentation hall. And Weinglass was talking, and then he got to a point where he was talking about the surveillance and what the government was doing, the Department of Just Us. And he said, and I'm followed everywhere. And he pointed up to the back, and not 20 feet from me was the FBI agent who's been following him around. And he singled him out and he invited him to talk. Well, during that trial, the former Attorney General, Ramsey Clark, was summoned to testify at the trial as to what his administration, when he was Attorney General, thought about prosecuting the Chicago 7. And he said, we decided not to do that. And what we were concerned was there was basically a police riot in Chicago in which police officers took their names off their bodies and they put their badges in their pockets because they were going to do what was right. And Mayor Daley, a Democrat, had decided he was going to run roughshod over what was fair and impartial, and he was going to have Hubert Humphrey nominated no matter what the downside was to the people. But the more interesting aspect was Ramsey Clark saying when he was Attorney General, they decided not to prosecute the case because they didn't think there was anything there worth prosecuting. But John Mitchell, on the other hand, thought otherwise, who ultimately was prosecuted. I saw part of the case in New York, and then there was, and that one didn't succeed, but he was later convicted. And so you had an Attorney General who was convicted who decided to go after the Chicago 7. What does that have to do with today? What it has to do with is we always have to be vigilant about what the Department of Justice is doing. Specifically, is our current Attorney General slowing down any investigation in various ways, not so obvious, so that there will be no prosecution of Trump? That's the question before us, and we have to talk and push so that we can change that if that's the case, and if not, at least add some swiftness to the prosecution. Because they'll be having debates soon, and we'll be hearing, I don't know if we can have a prosecution of a man who's running for office, who tried to overthrow the government, and that's his single achievement since then, from then till now. So I think you have to keep in mind that the Justice Department is not always dependable. In fact, in my experience from being a young man and a young lawyer and a young prosecutor and active in politics to this day, I'm glad I didn't learn how to do what I do in the Justice Department, because I just don't think the Justice Department is a model of justice, equanimity, of law, of fair dealing, of good practices. And there have been exceptions in the past. I think Ramsey Clark was one of those. I, in fact, met Ramsey Clark when he was in private practice, and we had a long conversation in my office about a case he was handling. But what we were more interested in is talking about each other's resumes. And I had appeared before his dad, Tom Clark, who had been on the Supreme Court and who rode circuit, if you will, appearing in various courts. And he appeared in the Second Circuit, which encompasses New York, where I was a prosecutor. And he paid myself and my opponent high praise for how we conducted our argument. So I sort of have two feelings about Tom Clark, the Supreme Court Justice, and Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General. Ramsey defended some pretty tough people in his time, and he wore it like a red badge of courage. Talking about judges, there's the judge in Georgia, and I saw a paper today, and I guess it was the Washington Post, and the statement was made that the judge had met with the jurors, and he told them that they had to be very careful speaking. And he made reference to their oath, which was they had to keep it secret about their deliberations. And he hasn't done anything since the deliberations have been exposed and discussed, violating the oath that they took. Now, you may say, well, we can get away with it, what does it matter? We shouldn't be getting away with anything. That is the point. Because when we lose the firm ground of law and, and of justice and of ethics, we lose the strongest tool we have. That is to secure the trust of the people that we're talking about what's right and important. And I don't think she has to be dragged through the streets. I think that she should be brought to a meeting and told, asked, why did you do that? And did you do that because the judge only mentioned those people who were involved in perjury? Is that the reason? And that Trump was not mentioned or referenced? Is that why you spoke? And that would be a legitimate reason, and I wonder if that isn't the reason. And of course, like everything, we'll find out in time. Some say, well, there'll be another grand jury. They should have had that grand jury, that is a regular grand jury from the beginning, but they didn't. I started, I guess, talking about animals, and since I was a kid, I've been big on animals. And though the South Bronx was not, I don't know, an easy place, I suppose. It was an adventure for a young man, and maybe not so much so for adults. But not far from where I live was the Bronx Zoo. And as I remember, you could go in free as a kid, and I went in there and spent lots of hours looking at the animals and so forth, and the lions roamed very close to where you could be near them, and there were animals walking the trails, and that and a thing that I watched called The Morning Farmer on Saturdays at 6 a.m. And I had to sit close to the TV, which was black and white, or green if I remember. And I had to sit close because I didn't want to wake my parents, because if they decided to get up, that was one thing, but I didn't want to be waking them just before 6 o'clock. And so I have that interest, have had it my whole life. And my parents didn't have much money, but when we went to upstate New York, we'd ride horses. We'd go to these historic places. I had read The Last of the Mohegans, and by Lake George, you could imagine the Chingachgook and other characters in James Fenimore Cooper's book up there. But where are we today? Well, there's a recent decision in the Fourth Circuit, which encompasses Virginia and other places, and including North Carolina. And they made an important decision that North Carolina cannot ban undercover filming at the animal farms. That is where animals are being abused and hurt. And there are laws nationwide against the abuse of animals that way. And I'm a vegetarian, and I understand probably most of the people who are listening to me are not vegetarians. But whatever it is that you think isn't necessary to your health, don't for a moment think that the food you eat has to be beaten and terrorized in violation of all sorts of rules and laws. I actually have been active in a group called the Non-Human Rights Group. And the theory of Steve Weiss, who founded it years ago, was that there are certain animals that obviously, primates in particular, suggest that there are certain sensitivities we should have about them given their ability to perceive and act and so forth like that. Some say those things don't matter. And if you've had a dog or a cat, you've seen that their reactions seem reasonable and so forth. So the Fourth Circuit has said that you can have an ag-gag, agricultural gag, because what they've been doing is a law in 2015 permitted you to prevent people from having access and seeing and using and publishing what's going on with the animals. So that's one thing, the animals. But there's another thing, and that is that there's an EWG group, a geospatial analysis group, and they have looked at how these the waste products from pigs and poultry are slipping into the water. And of course, that's contaminating the water because it's in the floodplain. And 2% of the, I don't know if it's 7,300 and some odd swine and poultry are in North Carolina, that this is causing a big problem. And now the other thing is you have concerns about contamination of water in the area that affects people. So whatever you think of animals, their waste products are not being curated in such a way to maximize individual health of the people who would otherwise consume the pigs and poultry. Isn't that something? And to return to the group that I'm with, there's a belief system that there are certain inalienable rights that attach to animals, and that we should keep those in mind. And if you spend any time with almost any animal, it's not a ferocious, hungry lion, you'll see what is the connection, I think, between us and animals. So I'm not getting too Gaia principle on you, but what we do is who we are, and how one treats an animal as an indication of how you treat other people. As a kid, I was a strange kid in the South Bronx in this sense. I might be strange today too, but one of the strange things was I was with a bunch of kids. We were in an alleyway, we were running around, and there was an insect, and daddy long legs, right? And this kid that I was with, he wanted to pull off its legs or hurt it. And I said, don't do that. And I said, I think that a praying mantis is an animal that is even a crime. I didn't foresee then that I might become a lawyer, but I always argued, and it had more to do with me being Irish than ever thinking about being a lawyer, I suppose. And he said, what was I going to do if he did that? And I said, I'm going to stop you and prevent you from doing that. And we were about equally matched, and I don't remember any fisticuffs. Years later, my mom and dad, we went up to the Catskills and we're staying at some place. We didn't have a lot of money, but we always found a place for the cabin. And I was outside, and it was dusk, and there was a kid by the side of this river that divided, and there was an island, and on the island there was a turtle. And he was throwing rocks over there. I said, you should be careful where you throw the rocks. And he said, why? I said, you're going to hit the turtle's shell, and that might end up killing him. And he says, well, what difference does that make? That's what I'm going to do. And I said, well, don't do that. You shouldn't do that. I was a little older, a little stronger, and had a few more street fights by that time. And my dad had insisted I take some martial arts, so I had some rules for how I should conduct myself. And he said he was going to throw this rock, and was I going to stop him? And I said, yeah, I am. And so I did. I mean, I got into a fist fight with him, and I prevented him from throwing the rock. And then pretty soon we had a circle of all the guests at this place where these cabins were. And my dad was apparently among the people in the circle watching this going on. And I gave the kid somewhat of a thrashing, I suppose. And so it broke up, and we walked away. And I'm walking away with my dad. And my dad says, what was that about? I said, well, he wanted to throw rocks, and he wanted to kill a turtle. My dad just shrugged his shoulders. That's my son. He didn't have any trouble with us fighting because, he had as a kid, and he had been a truant, but World War II changed him, and he was very smart and well-read. And that gene package from him and my mom, I think, is what helped me get out of the South Bronx. So there are several things to keep in mind, and that is our public policy should be common sense, particularly when it lends itself to that, like one group shouldn't get information everybody doesn't have, particularly about the January 6th committee, that we should be sensitive to the prosecution of a double murder in such a way that we should have good prosecutors who know how to cross-examine a witness, and the result may or may not come out right. Who's to say? It's an imperfect system. It's hardly laboratory conditions, particularly when you're talking about his corruption involving how he handled his firm, and that's being admitted in connection with a murder. It's just wrong, and it may be decided wrong on appeal if he's convicted. The people at the railroad lying to us about how safe it was when it wasn't, that's a disgrace. The fact that we should question the Department of Justice, particularly since there's so many data points of them doing nothing publicly to actually cause an accounting of the people who are responsible for the insurrection. The judge saying something's okay when the law says otherwise is just wrong. You take a wrong step in that direction, you just can only get worse. And then finally, my remarks about animals. No one should be cruel to an animal, number one. It says something about who we are as a people and what you are as an individual person, if you can deal with that. That we should have sunshine that allows us to know a lot about all the public issues, including what private firms may be doing to animals. We should not be allowing animal waste to mix into our waters and our land so that it compromises humans. What's the value there? And we have to recognize that animals have certain inalienable rights. And vigilance is obviously what's necessary in these times in which we're in a post-truth and post-law era. And we have to get back to that, because without that, we're closer to wild animals, and we are already treating each other as less than what we say is the value of a life. So thanks for joining me. I don't know how long I've been, but obviously I'm much warmer than I was not too long ago. And I'll try to be on the road tomorrow and talk to you from a walk and talk. All the best. Good evening. Bye-bye.